All right, I want to talk a little bit about Black European nobility. Um, a lot of people just don't understand that white people mainly was a small minority, say up until 1066, probably a little bit earlier. But whites mainly came out of South Africa. So a lot of the blacks who came up through, say, Central Africa or East Africa or West Africa, they eventually moved up north, mainly to Europe. So that's why a lot of that particular population was black. Later on, I think after 1066 or so, when whites got kicked out of Asia by Genghis Khan, they eventually moved into Europe. So before, say, 1066, all the nobilities was black. That was mainly probably, I think a little bit earlier, might have been a little bit earlier, where Greece, where Manuel the first, that was probably about the first influx of whites that eventually came through Greece and eventually came into Western Europe. I think up until 1800s or so, George the First is documented that he was black, and so there's a lot of black nobilities even up into the 1800s. The czars of Russia, black, the Pope, Pope Gregory. So mainly, a lot of people get confused when they think of whites as being European, which is mainly they came from southern Africa and eventually migrated to Asia because they mainly like the climate, probably up in Afghanistan, that area. I really don't think that before, say, modern society now, that people really made the distinction between white and black. I think this is mainly some modern thing that was probably cooked up to probably manipulate a certain group or certain a race of people. How whites ended up in Europe was mainly, I mentioned the person Manuel the First. He was a Greek nobility, aristocracy. And what happened was a lot of the whites that was living in Asia, somehow they got pushed out, I think Genghis Khan. So eventually, they cut a deal with the Europeans, at first with Greece, because it was mainly closer to where the whites lived at. So they eventually cut a deal where they would intermarry nobility, and they eventually moved into Greece, and eventually later on into other areas, into probably Germany, Russia, in that particular area. But before that, mainly whites just lived in probably in Afghanistan and those areas, probably in Russia and in Asia. Also to note is that from DNA research that whites are of a different, use the word different, but they all part of the human race. But they're what scientists are calling Neanderthals. So they're of that particular part of the human. Well, he used the word human race. But anyway, I don't know if they had I don't know. Anyway, eventually, from research and the scientists, and they said that mainly the whites that came out of Neanderthal people, they came out of southern Africa and migrated into Asia, because they could adapt to the climate, and so mainly that's why they lived in that particular area. Also to note, some of the kings, and I don't know how many of the kings from Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, I don't know too much about them, but somehow they cut a deal with the Moors, which mainly the people who ruled Spain, mainly the blacks. And so somehow they cut a deal, just like Greece, they cut a deal with the whites, and somehow they came to some type of agreement where, they would, mingle and try to live together. And that's what eventually happened in Europe. But I don't know at one point where the whites, while how it looks like the whites and the blacks just disappeared, but that's somehow, I guess that's nature, where you mingle and mix, and somehow it just turned out that way. But a lot of the John Hanson, he was one of the presidents of the USA, so it wasn't that much, I'd say, racism or anything like that. But how could you elect a president if you were racist? A black president if you were racist. John Hanson, he was black, so it was probably and King George, he was black. King George III. So it was a lot of blacks that that was in charge, and mainly in charge of Europe with the black nobility. I think a lot of the blacks, they eventually came over here because Europe was mainly getting crowded, and so I think eventually that's why they decided to move over to the States and try to colonize the U.S. and South America.